Okay, thanks very much then.
Everything okay with you over that side, Beej? You happy now?
Can you hear me clearly, yeah?
Brilliant, yes. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's e-Memoir session. We're looking at planning and delivering cost-effective traineeships program, And the session is going to be led by Beej Kaczmarczyk of the Learning Curve Group and e-Memoir. We like to keep the sessions as interactive as possible, so keep the questions coming. I'm going to hand over to Beej and mute myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marek, and good morning. Good morning especially to subscribers and other partners. Those who have not listened to me before, my name is Beej Kaczmarczyk, a Director of Learning Curve Group and e-Memoir. Over the next 50 to 55 minutes or so, I'll be looking at, I suppose, experience that we've had, certainly in the last 3 years, of not only delivering traineeships, but of course, refining that delivery in the light of experience, particularly focused on what I call the cost effectiveness side of traineeships. That's not just being efficient in the way in which we use the resource, but also in achieving optimum results and benefits for our trainees. Those of you, by the way, who have not yet offered traineeships, hopefully will cover some of the key issues that you should really consider in terms of planning and delivering those traineeships. And those of you who are already offering traineeships, an opportunity to reflect on the experience so far. So a little bit of background. Traineeships are a key element of the government's skills strategy, and this is reflected in its education and training policy. It's seen as a key aspect in giving those people who are 16 to 24 years old an opportunity through a traineeship to find employment, an apprenticeship, or move on to further learning. I think one of the key factors in any planning, and this is critical, this relentless from experience, is that a traineeship is not going to be efficient or effective if there isn't an effective partnership between yourself and the employers who are going to offer you the work placements, as well as the employers who are going to help prepare that work placement and reflect on the work placement so it becomes a high quality work placement. And it's the work placement that is the core learning aim in a traineeship, unlike other types of programs. I think one other thing to note is initially it was a requirement that in order to deliver a traineeship you had to be graded as either good or outstanding by Ofsted. Now this was removed from February of this year, and in effect from August of this year, any provider who would be able to make an effective contribution to the traineeship programs has been allowed to offer them. Numbers have increased steadily, and when I say steadily, it has been steady. By the time we got to January of this year, there were just over 42,000 actual starts on traineeships. Now that's not as much as the government intended, but nevertheless it's been a program that has taken a bit of time to get going, and that's one of the issues I want to pick up near the end. I think the critical bit here is that the government expects more and more employers to sign up as the program becomes better known and promoted. And I think one of the key elements here is that on reflection, really traineeships should have been promoted at the same time as apprenticeships as part of a single offer that would have got, I think, more interest and more involvement of employers. So what is a traineeship? Essentially it's an education and training program. We've got to see it that way. It is not an apprenticeship. In most cases, it's not a full-time program. It's a program that offers the young person aged 16 to 24 a significant amount of work placement, maybe with one employer, possibly with more, but with all the things that go around that, the work preparation, the induction, the vocational or professional or technical expertise or skills that they need, as well as the English and maths. And the aim is really to develop those skills and experience that those people often have as a barrier to their entry into the labour market, so they can sustain employment, and preferably employment with an apprenticeship attached to it. And what the evidence is showing is that there's two main reasons why young people have found it difficult to access the labour market. The first of those is a lack of a high quality work experience, understanding the world of work, being in the world of work, learning in the world of work. And secondly, it's been the problems that they often have with English and maths in terms of those building blocks that they need for further training and education. So what are the characteristics? And I think if you bear this in mind, it is critical, particularly those of you that have not yet delivered traineeships, that part of your design characteristics must be this much more holistic approach. It's not about separate subjects, it's not about separate qualifications. It's about focusing on the young person, engaging them, particularly if they've not been engaged for a while, and developing their confidence and skills to be able to then access the labour market. So a much more holistic approach, which is evidenced also in the way in which the programme is then planned and the actual elements are put together. The one thing about traineeships that I think we've all learned from experience, particularly over the last 3 years, is that if you offer a traineeship as a standalone standard sort of programme off the shelf, it will not actually work. It has to be very much tailored to the needs of the individual, particularly if those individuals have got different priorities, different interests, and different levels of English and maths or other experience when you come in. But the key thing here is the emphasis must be on the learner's outcomes, what aspirations they have, and their most likely destination. And that thinks very much with the principles underpinning, for example, study programs for young people. I think we also have learned that without good quality information, advice and guidance, all the support mechanisms, whether they be support for the learning or support for the learner, as well as strong progress tracking, feedback, as well as involvement of the employer, it's going to be critical. And I think when you look at the inspection framework that's been in place for a while now, you see that that emphasis is certainly reinforced. One point to note is that all trainees are fully funded. The only exceptions would be if an adult trainee was, for example, doing a flexible program that included a level 3 program, and that obviously is something I'll look at later on. In most cases, and the evidence shows this, most of the people on traineeships are following level 1 and level 2 programs. And I think, as I said, the key driver in this, and I would say without this, it is very difficult to actually offer a traineeship that's going to be effective. You must have effective engagement with your prospective employers. The employers that could offer a work placement, particularly where you have a lead employer offering that work placement, but also, if not necessarily offering a work placement leading to a real job, at least offering an exit interview or a formal interview that might help the person secure a job. But in most cases, we are looking for employers who will be looking to take on staff where there are some vacancies available. And if those vacancies don't come to fruition, at least that formal exit interview will give the person or the young person experience of being interviewed and possibly with references for other employers. We found that certainly from experience in the retail sector where there have been traineeships where sometimes the young person has had a work placement, say with Debenhams. At the end of the work placement, that vacancy didn't match. However, there was a vacancy in, say, Accessorize or in Costa Coffee or in another part of the retail development which was appropriate for that young person. Since they've had that experience and since the interview would have recorded all the pluses and all of the characteristics and attributes that they brought through the work placement, then it's been successful. So I think those characteristics are critical. When you're building your traineeship program, it isn't an off-the-shelf sort of standardized program, and I would suggest also it's not one where you just think, well, let's infill that learner to a whole lot of other or to programs that are already running without actually having a clear understanding of how individual and personalized it must be. And that's what the good providers have learned. So I think that the key element in any planning and designing of a traineeship is a matching process. And I think this is, for me, the hard bit at the beginning, because even if you offer a traineeship program, say you decide that you're going to pilot it with 12 learners, which I know some providers have said they're going to do next year, is to make sure that that process involves a very carefully thought out match between the employer, because you've already got the employer, and that prospective employer must be clear about what their expectations of the traineeship are, and also what the probabilities of a job are with training. That's then matched to the aspirations and needs of the individual learner, and that matching process must take a bit of time. So whether you use profiling, whether you use open questions, interviews, or whatever systems you use, that match is critical. Because then the program itself will be the means by which the needs of the employer if you want the demands of the employer, are then matched to the needs of the learner, the capabilities of the learner, and what you expect to be the resultant outcomes of a traineeship for both the learner and the employer. So the employer must benefit and the learner must benefit. And that program is the means by which you do it. Obviously, there were some restrictions originally on which providers could be then put into the process, but you as the provider act as that, if you want, broker or as that intermediary. And that's why it was important initially for traineeships to get going, that those providers were good quality providers. But I think irrespective of your inspection grade, whoever in your organization is responsible for organizing, planning, designing, delivering, and accounting for traineeships must bear this in mind. And I'm sure on reflection, those of you that have successfully run traineeships, and I know some of you have, to what extent would you agree that that matching process before the actual traineeship starts is absolutely critical? If you've got any weaknesses or any gaps in that, I think your traineeships are already significantly at risk, even if you get them going and you get enough learners on them. So at this point, I just want to open up the debate. To what extent would you agree with my assertion there that the matching process is absolutely critical to a successful traineeship, particularly those of you who are listening in who have offered traineeships in the past? We've got a couple of hands going up. Any comments that you want to make about that? Sarah, thanks very much. It's vital. I think that's reinforcing the point I'm trying to make. And I think that if you bear that in mind, even if you only run a limited traineeship offer, it will be a successful or a more successful offer. And maybe sometimes if you risk maybe going for a very large offer, you know, in the teens or in the hundreds, without that matching process, it can be, of course, a risk that you're taking. Thanks again for all of those who have supported that. And I see that as absolutely essential. I know it's hard work, and sometimes you might think, well, if the matching process doesn't provide those results, then it'd be better not to offer that traineeship, particularly from the point of view of what might be the experience of the learner and how that might be viewed by funders as well as Ofsted. So there's some good points there being raised. Thanks very much for those comments. Who is eligible to go on a traineeship? Now, those eligibility rules have changed slightly over the last 3 years, but essentially it's 16 to 24s who have not yet achieved the full level 3. And I think that's therefore limiting it obviously in terms of the age, the eligibility of those learners, but also it is really more approved for those people that haven't yet achieved their level 1 and 2 provision. In many cases, any progression to level 3 will occur after the traineeship. The second thing is that they have had little or no work experience. That was, and what we mean here is that it's also been a work experience that's given them any indications or any insight into the world of work. They must have the potential to be ready for an apprenticeship or employment within 6 months of completing the traineeship. I see that as vital. It's part of the matching process. The traineeship is not for example, you're not in education employment training or disillusioned, disengaged, and perhaps really more difficult to work with. For the adults in particular, they can be unemployed at the start of the traineeship. So, in other words, if they're on job seekers allowance or universal credit, they can be employed, by the way, particularly if they're earning less than 16 times the hourly national minimum wage each week, or £330 a month. So that's that new definition, which you're all aware of. Guides the way in which the Skills Funding Agency funds activity. As we'll see later on, 2 agencies are actually funding the activity, the Education Funding Agency for 16 to 18-year-olds and the Skills Funding Agency for 19 to 24s. One other point to note, eligibility also includes young people up to and including the age of 24, but less than 25 when they start the programme, who have education healthcare plans, and in which case they are funded throughout the training by the Education Funding Agency, using the funding formula that we use for study programs, and I'll obviously pick that up. So you have to make sure that the young person is eligible and meet those criteria. And I know that one of you has already asked, are there any restrictions on benefit claimants? For example, someone has joined down job seekers allowance or universal credit. The only restriction really is that on a traineeship, if you add all the elements together, the work experience, the induction, English and maths, it should not come to more than 35 hours a week. The other restriction, and it's a good question, thanks for that, the other restriction is if they're a benefits claimant, the work experience is usually a maximum of 240 hours. Most traineeships, the work experience is between 100 and 240 hours. But for someone who's a benefit claimant, the work experience is limited to a maximum of 240 hours. It can, however, be extended if the trainee is being made an offer of an apprenticeship. They've accepted it, but they're not yet available to start it. So there can be some exceptions to that. So obviously, check up with your local Job Centre Plus and to make sure that those are consistently being applied. As I said, that's who traineeships are designed for. They're not really intended for the most disengaged young people who might actually need a pre-traineeship program, or those that already have the qualifications, skills and experience needed to start an apprenticeship or find work, or those already in a job where maybe other training would be more appropriate for them. So those are some of the restrictions. In terms of the provider, and I know listening in, most of you are both EFA and SFA contracted. Well, if you're already grant funded or contracted, then you can use your existing allocations to deliver 16 to 18 traineeships and also 19 to 24 traineeships. If you've only got a contract to deliver 16 to 18 apprenticeships through the SFA, then you can offer 16 to 18 traineeships as well, but you mustn't use your allocation for apprenticeships to deliver the traineeships. You'll have to get an additional allocation. One point to note is that because the take-up of traineeships has not been as high as was expected, there are often market entry opportunities, for example, going through the register of training organisations, for those providers that haven't got a direct contract to be able to apply to offer traineeships. I know some of you that have listened in previously have actually done so, particularly if you've been subcontractors before. By the way, as I've said already, the requirement to be graded good or outstanding by Ofsted has been removed in order to encourage, nevertheless, good quality areas to contribute to traineeships. So, what is it that makes up a traineeship? And remember, you're recording this through the ILR, so you have to make sure that you define that young person's program very carefully as a traineeship, because it must include as a core learning aim, and the majority of the hours actually, work experience, which can be with one employer, it can be with two, and sometimes we do record two employers where it's been useful for the young person to have a varied experience, as long as those two come to at least 100 hours for adults. A work preparation training, including job seeking and CV development, which in some cases will lead to a qualification, in other cases it won't. I'll look at that in a minute. English and maths, particularly if those learners have not yet attained a GCSE A star to C or a level 2 functional skill. But please remind yourselves that for 16 to 18-year-olds, English and maths is a condition of funding, although there are flexibilities that were introduced last year that cover, for example, part-time programs and smaller programs of less than 150 hours, which can, of course, include a traineeship. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I know there's a question about that, about would a grade D be required to do a resit? And in answer to your question, although I'm going to come to it later, is if you've got a young person, 16 to 18, that's doing a traineeship and they've got a grade D, because a traineeship is considered to be a part-time program, the condition is not applied. So they're not required to do a GCSE resit if they've got a grade D. For a very good reason. The program might not be long enough, or it might occur in between assessment points for GCSEs. The flexible element has created a little bit of a problem, because the flexible element can be a vocational, a technical, a professional qualification. Here, the reason I've made a note is that you can include those which are of what we call Section 96 for young people. For adults, you've got to, if you're wanting to include a technical or professional qualification, they must form part of the core offer. And therefore, it's very important that you use the hub to make sure that any qualification that you're offering, say, for example, like a level 1 award or something like that for an adult, is actually eligible to be funded. And that's what that point is about. What underpins all of this is an assumption that there will be mentoring and support. And that mentoring and support, by the way, will not only be from you, the provider. A key element when you look at successful traineeships has been the involvement of the actual employer in terms of providing on-the-job support, and in some cases not only doing that, but also sharing in the delivery of things like English and maths and other aspects of the program. And I think it's critical, therefore, that as we move towards devolution, particularly of the adult education budget, this is more important for your 19 to 24-year-olds, that any traineeship is designed with the employer in mind, particularly where it's appropriate for the local labour market needs. So, for example, a new development in our area, IKEA is building a major retail outlet as well as a warehouse hub. It seems logical that we as providers have a chat with the IKEA and say, what kind of labour do you need? What skill sets do you need? If that's going to employ several hundred people, of whom a proportion will be young people, then can we possibly run a traineeship for you to ensure that you have a steady supply of skilled, motivated, job-ready learners that are going to help IKEA get going. And that means placing them, for example, in other stores that might be nearby. So that's what we mean by that sort of planned, if you want, approach that meets the needs of the local labour market. And a good example of that is the work that it's a good way of linking what you're doing directly into things like a major development. And I think that's what's making, again, traineeships difficult for us. As one of you has commented, the more you individualise, the less likely it's going to be cost effective. And that's why, to some extent, what has been successful is linking it to where, for example, there is a common pathway that you can take. So, for example, as I said, retail is a good example. IKEA is not going to employ just retail assistants. It's going to employ people in IT, in catering, in warehousing, in logistics. So you can have a core experience which allows you, therefore, to not only to individualize the program for each person that wants to work there, because they want to work in different parts, and yet you've got a common core of activity in terms of the work placement, common activities. A couple of points to note that it is important that you bear that in mind when you design it. The program itself is usually between 6 weeks and 6 months. Again, I think from listening in to what do you call it? To those that I'm just looking at the listeners who have actually offered traineeships. Again, what's the average length of time that you're offering your traineeships over? Has there been any sort of variance there? So just a little question for those of you currently offering traineeships. Brilliant, Steve. Good to see that Sheffield have taken advantage of what I said there. Sarah, you're doing them over 13 weeks. Thank you. Any other sort of variation? 18 weeks, one of you. Good, good. So you can see that there's a range of, and that obviously makes it more difficult for you to offer some of those bigger qualifications. Again, it's got to be driven by the individual needs of the employer, because the employer might be waiting to take on staff at a certain time, but also, and we found this particularly with the commercial horticulture, Wyvale, Dovies, they were very keen on making sure that the traineeship programs had the young person ready to take up employment around Easter, so around the March and April. So you work backwards from when the jobs were going to become available to the beginning of the placement, to the beginning of the traineeship, which meant that sometimes it was between 12 and 18 weeks in order to make sure you maximize the employment opportunities. So the length of the program, again, should reflect that sort of, if you want, bit of planning. In terms of what makes up the key, if you want, performance management of a traineeship, you've got to bear this in mind when you actually design it. When you're planning it, remember that from the point of view of quality indicators, we're looking for 3 progression routes from a traineeship. An apprenticeship, and that's a sort of seen as critical. Employment with further training if the person is still in the raising participation age group, so they're still being up to 18, now 18 by the way. And further study, and which originally was only an approved outcome for young people, 16 to 18, since September 2015, that's also become an approved outcome for 19 to 24-year-olds. And you can see there that for each there's a little bit more definition of what will be an acceptable progression route. That's going to be critical when we're looking at the performance of your traineeship programs. And in particular, the concern is that not enough learners are going into the first of those routes, which is apprenticeships, and we'll see that that's a key issue that's being picked up through evaluation. The other point when you're designing a traineeship is to make sure that the English and Maths, again, is considered as being a key component, as a core component, particularly if those learners have not yet achieved A star to C, or the new grade on the new GCSE, or of course a level 2 functional skill. The condition of funding does apply to 16 to 18-year-olds on a traineeship. They're expected, therefore, if they've not already achieved one of the above, to continue to study English and Maths. However, there's a lot more flexibility around that English and Maths. For example, they would be able to do the stepping stone qualifications or components of, for example, English and Maths where it's appropriate depending on their initial assessment. This means that those who have got a GCSE grade D are not required, therefore, to do a resit. Clearly, if they've got a functional skill at level 2, and let me just add that's quite rare, there would be a requirement for those learners to upgrade that to a GCSE. As I said, that is not a common feature, but nevertheless it is there in theory. Also, if you run a traineeship of less than 150 hours, then again it's not required to do an English or Maths qualification that's recognised for a condition of funding purposes. You might simply do some English and Maths to move the person on, and you record those outcomes using RAP or whatever. For adults in particular, if you find that the traineeship, at the end of the traineeship, they haven't yet completed their English and Maths, or ESOL, by the way, because don't forget ESOL is also eligible, then there is no funding penalty because in effect they can continue to study it either on an apprenticeship or on an FE program if that's what they progress to. And therefore I think it's important to recognise that on some occasions, if, for example, they complete a traineeship or even don't complete it but get a job before the end, is that this will not incur on you a penalty for not completing English and Maths as long as you give them enough time to complete it after the program is completed with you. So the English and Maths is an important element. How you then structure the program, well, the funding really does, in both cases, whether the EFA funds it or the SFA, the funding basically is demand-led. It depends on how you've structured the program. So you've got to make sure you design it and structure it with the employer in mind, in agreement obviously with the young person. That determines the length. It will also determine the pathway. You might say, let's offer just one pathway. Let's just offer a pathway in engineering or a pathway in retail. But you might offer several pathways coming out of the same core, as I'll show you later on. One of the things about this is that I think, again, a practical experience of traineeships has shown us that just focusing on one pathway and doing it really well has been actually a better model. You can look at, for example, Western, which is a good example from the college sector. You look at Babcock from the training provider sector, that very often they've narrowed down the number of pathways to get some economies of scale, but also because that was in demand, particularly from the particular location of that provider, Western, for example, with the tourism, the catering and hospitality sector around them. The activities, again, will reflect individual needs. For example, you can do work preparation programs, you can do preparatory training, you can even use your realistic work environment and simulation as part of work preparation. However, can I just add, the work placement must be with an external employer. So you obviously, with some trainees, you might find it better to do a wee bit of work preparation where they spend some time in a realistic work environment to just get them ready to go on their external placement. That obviously is work preparation. It is also important to build in what we call milestones and stepping off points, because again, if there are job opportunities, it would be unfair on a trainee to insist that they complete the traineeship if that while they're on their placement, there's a stepping off point that says, oh, we could take you forward for an interview now, there's a full-time post with an apprenticeship, and it would be wrong not to allow that young person that opportunity. As one of you has already said, the viability, particularly when you've got mixed age groups, so you've got 16 to 18 and 19 to 24s, and I've asked this question before, most of us have found that keeping those separate has been better, just simply in terms of the culture and climate it creates. But again, viability, when you've only got 12 learners, it might be difficult to do that. One other point to note, it is useful for you to get a bit of what I'd call value added, and this might help to promote traineeships. I wish it had been more of it had been done if there was some added recognition. In other words, not just the completion of the traineeship or of a qualification, but that the providers and employers could issue a locally recognized certificate that might be used to access the young person into the world of work. For example, through your local enterprise partnership. Can I just check, for those of you who have been offering traineeships, have any of you managed to secure certification or recognition from, for example, the local enterprise partnership or the LEP or, for example, the combined authority? Not as such. Not as such. Okay, well, I think that's something that, again, might have helped to promote them and get perhaps more buy-in. I will come back to, by the way, the stepping off points. I know one of you has asked what happens if a person steps off before the end of the program in terms of retention. I'll pick that up in a few moments. As you can guess, it shouldn't affect your performance if you've actually managed to get the person a job, and particularly a job with training, if that was the primary reason they came on the actual program. So I think that's a good point to note. Thank you. So that's how the program's structured. Here's an example of a very traditional structure that we ran at the beginning, a 6-month traineeship. You can see that this was a college-based one where the learners were coming in 1 day or 1.5 days a week for tutorial, English and maths. The work placement happened in months 2 to 5. And at the beginning there was an induction, a sort of employment skills job prep part. And at the very end there was also, again, getting ready for the interview, getting ready for the interview for a real job, and also sussing out other career options and further training that might be available. Very traditional. You could apply this to almost any type of program, and I know you could make it, if it was an 18-week program, obviously you'd condense that. One of the things we've certainly found from experience of running traineeships, an effective traineeship, is the sooner the learner is in the work placement, the better. That's what characterizes a traineeship. That's to some extent what you've guaranteed or what you've offered them as a, if you want, an added value benefit of going on the traineeship is the work placement. So I wouldn't leave that too long. Another example, and it comes back to this issue about how do you get cost effective when you've got maybe lots of individual routes. Well, it's very often a large chunk of your actual traineeship is a core, and that work placement, obviously, it depends on what the particular interest of the learners are. I've got 3 learners here, so there'll be a work placement for one of them in working with children, one in graphic design, and one in customer service. So that obviously requires the appropriate staffing in terms of the assessor, tutor, or mentor. But in terms of induction, work preparation, English and maths, those learners could be taught together. They could have a core of activity, which then allows them to have effective preparation for their individual work placements. And then obviously they could, with other learners who are already doing those awards, do those programs along with them. So you can see that you can allow that bit of a core activity to give you some benefits of scale, and then the individualized bit would be the routes that they take in terms of flexible delivery. So for example, for IKEA, I would suggest you could have quite viable groups just doing the customer service level 1 award. If you're working with, for example, a major local authority, you might get enough learners to come forward to make a viable group, for example, in working with children, an example we got from one of the Merseyside colleges. So those are the sort of what I call planning and design features which are absolutely critical. In terms of funding and making sure that you've got a cost-effective delivery, let me just scoot through or just go through those 2 sources of funding. 16 to 18-year-olds are funded as part of study programs. So basically you add together all of the activities or elements, and that gives you a total what we call funding band for the planned activities. Now the funding here is critically linked to core learning aim, and one of you has already asked. The core learning aim is the work placement. So I'll come back to what counts as retention on the work placement, particularly if the person gets a job before the end of the placement. The individual learner can still draw down funding in terms of disadvantage funding, in terms of priority in English and maths, the postal codes, and any learning support funding that applies in terms of a recognised learning needs. You could have a high needs trainee. The 16 to 18-year-olds can also access the bursary fund, can also access obviously free meals where it's appropriate. And of course, as I said, they can also continue to claim benefits if they're 18, etc. So there are some characteristics there, but what is critical is that external work experience, which is the core learning and the bulk of what they do. It is critical, therefore, that you understand that this is part of the raising participation age, about keeping people in education and training, certainly up to the age of 18. So I think there's some good examples of how that works, and thanks for the examples, by the way, of certificates being offered by the chambers. Thanks for that contribution as well in response to the previous question. So you can see that it depends on which one of those bands that young person goes into. And I know there are some examples of quite significant numbers of learners in band 2 and 3. We've had 1 or 2 in band 5. It does raise some issues about whether you can get 540 hours into less than 26 weeks. But nevertheless, that would be looked at, by the way, as an exception. It shouldn't be a common model that you've got, partly because obviously a large chunk of that will be the work placement. So for example, here's a very traditional model. You can see it reflects a band that gives you £2,700, 200 hours on the work placement. The tutorial, again, is a non-qualification, English and maths at whatever appropriate level. In both cases, these were functional skills. You do not need to offer a qualification in employability skills. You could just simply say that's part of induction or work preparation. So with a young person, there are some opportunities to offer, as part of the traineeship, non-qualification activity, which contributes clearly along with the work placement, induction, etc., CV writing and things like that. But in this case, this learner was offered an additional qualification. So you can see that in effect, we're looking for 3 qualification outcomes: employability skills, English and maths. The critical thing here is what is the activity and what is the retention on the work placement, because that determines whether you're going to secure the maximum funding, and also is critical in terms of quality outcomes. And that's what you're going to be measured again, and I'll come back to in a minute. One of you has raised the issue, well, what would be cost effective? Well, let's assume that on that program I've had 12 starters. Let's assume 8 got to the end of the program, or 8 secured a job before the end of the program, what counts as a completion. We had 4, and this was an early example of traineeship where the matching was not effective. We had actually 4 non-completers. That means they didn't complete the work placement, they didn't progress to employment, they didn't progress to traineeship, and didn't progress to a further course. They just simply dropped out. Now, if they became starts, and in this case this program was 18 weeks, so after 2 weeks they became a start, they went on the ILR, you know that any non-completer, in effect, the funding goes down by 50%. You lose half the funding through the lag number effect next year. So theoretically, I should have earned £32,000, 32,400. 8 completers earned me the full 2,700, and the 4 non-completers earned me half of that. So my total income is 27,000 without any disadvantage. But this is just using the standard costing model that most of you are aware of. I then put in the cost of the lecturers. These are all direct costs. They don't include the overhead. The cost of mentors to do the coaching and tutoring, and the cost of assessors who will visit these trainees when they're on their work placement, as well as materials. When I've costed all of those activities, it comes to 13,500, which gives me a contribution of 13,500. So I would say that that's an efficient program because it's given me a 50% contribution to my overheads. However, I would not say it's an effective program because I've got, obviously, a 33% non-completion, and that is not a good non-completion rate. Certainly wouldn't be acceptable in any of the providers I work with. So you can see that it's a cost-efficient model. I would not describe it as a cost-effective. Can I just ask, how many of you who are listening are using a sort of planning model for your traineeships based on something like this, using something like ProResource or EBS, one of those systems that allows you to model what would be a traineeship program and its contribution? Yeah, we've got a few hands going up there. So some of you are actually using something like that to work out what the funding is. Good, good. Yeah. So just because one of you asked the question, how do we measure retention on a traineeship, 16 to 18 traineeship? Then I think what is critical, and Marcus, you've already suggested this, if you've got a positive outcome, if they complete the planned hours and they progress to employment, then you retain all the funding, and it's also positive in quality terms. If you find that the learner completes the planned hours in a core lane but doesn't progress to the successful outcome, which is retention in funding terms, you will keep all the money, but it's negative in quality terms. If you find that the trainee leaves the core early and progresses to successful outcomes, this is retained, so you keep the funding, and it's also positive in quality terms. So thanks very much for that contribution. That simply reinforces the point I've made. If the trainee leaves early, like in the previous example, and does not achieve a successful outcome, you will have lost in retention terms, because we had a 33% non-retention rate. It's also negative in quality terms, so it's neither efficient nor is it effective, even though I was still able to cover my total cost in that previous model. So hopefully that's clarification of the point there that was raised. For adults, well, from this year, 16-17, they're funded through the adult education budget. Any traineeship elements which were previously funded at one rate would continue into this year. New qualifications would be funded using the matrix, what they call the single activity matrix, or one of the other measures that we've got for provision for adults, such as what's the size of the qualification, is it a GCSE, or what are the planned guided learning hours, or the total qualification hours. What has been different for some time now is that for all adults, that's 19 to 24-year-olds, who are funded through the adult education budget, we've now combined the funding rate for work experience, where there used to be 3 rates, and the work preparation, CV writing, etc., at £970. So there's no separate funding for work preparation. Please make a note of that. So any flexible elements must include, therefore, qualifications or units which are approved to be funded for adult learners. Again, the methodology here is slightly different from young people, where young people you get 100% of funding if they're retained, you lose 50% if they're not retained. Here, 80% of your funding is attached to retention by the month, and 20% to the achievement of all elements of the program, including the work placement. So that's quite critical. So there's funding there for the functional skills, 80-20, any flexible vocational or technical qualification, 80-20, and the work placement, 80-20. In other words, that £970, that £970 is earned 80% on retention, 20% on successful outcome. Adult learners can also access learner support, access to work funding, using the normal rules there, and particularly for disabled learners, we'll come back to that, or learners with disabilities. And also please note that it's those outcomes which I've mentioned once before that are critical for determining what a successful outcome is for adults. So for any new provision that you've been running this year, you would work out what the size of the qualification is in terms of its guided learning hours, and that would give you a value. But by the way, for most traineeships, the predominant weightings are around A. There are some exceptions, as obviously depending on the vocational element that you're doing. But for all young people, that young person doing a traineeship is always weighted at 1. For adults, it depends on the elements that make up that program. And if they're obviously doing GCSEs or functional skills, then those are also funded through these individual levels of funding that we have. So, for example, if an adult is doing a GCSE English or Maths as part of a traineeship, they're funded at £811, not £724, £811. And if you've got an adult doing functional Maths at entry level, that's funded at £941. So just bear those in mind as aspects of the way it works. So what you do is you then construct for that individual learner, again, a program. So here we've got The Level 1 award in CV writing, by the way, which is not separately funded now, it's part of that £970. We've got functional skill in English and Maths, and we've got a Level 1 certificate in land-based studies, which, let's just assume it's a new one, is it's 96 contact hours, would give us a funding of £600. And you can see that that £3,000, each element, you know, if you look at the top element in terms of work placement, that would be 80% on retention, 20% achievement. So would the same would be for the functional skills. So much would also be for the certificate in land-based studies. So that's another example of a traineeship. So those are the, if you want, the funding models. And what is critical here is that you can see that maximizing the English, the funding is very much dependent on those elements being completed, particularly for adults, and obviously the successful outcome is also critical. Marcus is, if a learner has a level 3 qualification, can you effectively run a similar program under study programs with the main aim as work experience? The answer is, Marcus, yes, but you cannot call it a traineeship because traineeships are not eligible for funding for people who already have a level 3. One other thing, by the way, is just an issue. If an adult wants to do a level 3, say it's part of their flexible, then they have to take a loan if they're aged 19 and over and they've never used their first level 3 entitlement before. They have to take a loan. It's complication, and no, it's complicated. It's not likely to occur. So I think that's an issue to bear in mind. Now, one of you has asked that, well, if the core learning aim is a good quality work experience, what principles should guide us? Well, they're exactly the same principles as would guide work experience on a study program. It should be relevant to the trainee's aspirations. So if I'm looking for a job at Wyvale, I should be getting a work placement with commercial horticulture. If I'm looking for warehousing opportunities at IKEA, it would help to have a placement with a warehouse in the retail industry. Your organisation must be really committed to getting a good quality work placement system in place. That senior staff who have got that responsibility. I found again where you've got key members of staff at senior level responsible for good quality work experience, all learners, study program learners, trainees will benefit. I think it's critical there's a clear written agreement with details of what's going to happen between the trainee, the employer and you. And it should be after a structured induction with clear objectives relating most importantly to your vocational study. One of your colleagues said to me last week that good quality work placement on a traineeship is a function of all the elements coming together, being integrated, so that even if they're doing a vocational part of an element, a short qualification, that links continuously back to that placement. And it should be possible to map, and Steve knows this, certainly from Sheffield, to map whatever happens on the placement to the English and Maths that they're doing, as well as the assumed feedback and review we're getting from the learner, from the employer and the provider. And I think therefore, whatever system you're using, ProMonitor or any other system, it is critical that when a learner is on a work placement, particularly if every week we've already planned their activities with the employer or the employer's representative, that we can map it over to what English and Maths they'll be doing, as well as the employability, and I would also add the digital skills, and then to record that through, say, e-assessor or smart assessor or e-portfolio, whatever system you're using, so that the learner sees how critical the English and Maths is right across all of their experience, including, of course, the core learning aim, the work placement. I think that's one of the issues which has made them less than effective, but as one of you said again, it does mean you've got to have, in effect, a strong work placement culture in your organisation, which you can then extend to traineeships. If you haven't got a strong work placement culture or systems or organisation for any of your learners, then you're in a weaker position, certainly with traineeships. There are sources of funding for trainees which come, these are all different forms of support. I've already mentioned learning support, learner support in terms of things like travel, meals, etc., as well as obviously for those learners with disabilities, they can access to work funds. Particularly this is relevant for supported internships, as well as obviously maintaining their access to universal credits, subject to those conditions I said before. So just bear that in mind. What has happened so far, and I think this is just my final set of points about planning effective. If you look at the experience of traineeships to now, and there's some really good experience, there's some sort of middling experience, and then there's some very bad experience, which has put some people off. I think what we see from all of the reports, particularly from inspection reports, but also by just talking to providers, we offer our own traineeships working with partners, and we found quick movement from classroom to work placement or experience is critical. The sooner they're in the work placement, the better, as long as it's a high quality one. Integrating all elements of the program, the English and Maths, the induction, the work prep, and any flexible elements such as vocational or technical qualifications is critical. If there's a disconnect between the flexible element, such as say a technical certificate or a level 1 award or a level 1 certificate, and the work placement, it's not going to be as effective. Regular contact to make sure the provider knows what the employer is doing and ensuring, particularly if there's safeguarding issues, please be aware of that. I think structured workbooks, progress diaries completed by the trainee and signed off by the employer using electronic means as well as the training provider is critical. Mentoring and supervision not only from you, the workplace assessors, but also from whoever it is in the workplace you're using. So for example, if it's a little guest house in Weston-super-Mare, have you engaged the owner of that guest house in making sure that they are recording and being aware of what the learner is trying to do, so they're adding value to the owner of the business, but also that owner of the business understands they've got some responsibility for supervising, coaching and helping that young person maybe make the first steps into that sector. I think a good quality exit interview following a work placement with the employer is absolutely critical, because that's either going to be preparation for a formal job interview or a reference that can take somewhere else. Unfortunately, the last element, the one that we're all wanting to see, has been one of the weakest aspects. Where you've had really good progression to employment apprenticeships, you've had effective traineeships. Where it hasn't been, that's been often the result. So what issues and concerns have we raised? You do know that there's been significant issues around the relatively low take-up, especially in FE colleges. I mean, only 26% of starts on traineeships since 2013-14 have been in colleges. The bulk of them have been with independent training providers. And particularly what was concerning there was that some of those colleges, which are grade 1 and grade 2, were not actually offering traineeships, or had offered traineeships and had not been any take-up. I think the traineeship opportunity has been difficult to market. And I think one of the reasons is that this should have been promoted as part. When we've been talking about the 3 million apprenticeships that we want to see as starts by 2020, as well as the new Trailblazer standards, much more should have been made of how do you access those. And one way of accessing them is through a traineeship. And I think some of the national campaigns haven't been particularly effective. Some local campaigns have been, particularly where we've got some providers which have had several hundred trainees take up the offer. It's been sometimes more a function of the subcontractor than of the prime. The subcontractor's just been better at marketing. I think one of the big issues is it's either from the point of view of the employer or the young person, or even from our point of view, we're not really quite sure what the purpose of a traineeship is. And I think that's why it is critical that we have some understanding of, is this a pre-apprenticeship? If it is, then let's make sure that we say that this traineeship is leading you to an apprenticeship, this traineeship is leading to an employment, this traineeship is leading you to further study. One point to note, and thanks Marcus by the way, I didn't confirm that, if a learner gets to the end of the planned hours, but there's no success in terms of an end destination, do we give back 50% of the funding? No, if it's a young person and they're EFA funded, they're 16 to 18. If they get to the end of the planned program and they've been retained to the planned program, you will have retained them. Therefore, you'll keep 100% of the funding. It's if they don't retain to the end of the program and they don't have a positive outcome, then obviously you will have to give back 50% of funding, because the non-retention factor is 50%. But that, you won't give it back. It simply gets factored into next year's allocation to you through what we call the lag number effect. So that's in response to your question, Marcus. It's slightly different arrangement if they're an adult. As I said, if an adult completes the program, is retained, is 80% of funding, and if they don't complete the qualification or don't get the positive outcome, you lose 20% of funding. It's not 50%. There is a situation in which some adults, if they get a positive outcome before the end of the program, you can claim half of the achievement funding. In other words, half of the 20%, you can claim 50%. Oh, maybe that's what you refer to. But that's only for adults. I think the other real issue has been that employers just haven't bought in. And even when they have, they've always been with a bit of hesitation and not fully understanding what I think the requirements are. I think it's critical that we make the requirements transparent from the very beginning. And if the employer knows what they're committing to, then that's good. If not, then at least we haven't incurred a bad experience. I think the biggest issue here is that the overall progression to apprenticeship so far has been very low. Overall, that's between young people and adults, it's only 22%. So it is not achieving its aim if it was predominantly a pre-apprenticeship program. And that's, by the way, been better for young people than it has been for adults. Now, there are some examples of really good practice, again, well worth using the traineeship websites and the work placement websites to find out what those good practices have been. Very little has been reported yet through inspection, and that's to some extent indicating a low take-up, particularly by some college providers. The other thing is, and certainly one of you has already expressed concern, is having two funding regimes, one for young people with a different set of rules, for example, what is retention, and a different one for adults where 80% is retention by the month, 20% on achievement of the outcome or qualification. Confusion, it's extra admin. I know some of you say, yeah, but we know these systems quite well, but nevertheless, if you were new, you'd say, well, why don't we have a single funding model, like, for example, we're going to have from next May for apprentices? Might be a possibility, and certainly I think it would make life easier. So last but not least, be aware that traineeships are now separately inspected. We've got a more holistic approach, as we know, to grading all types of provision. Personal development, behaviour and welfare is now a new aspect of grading, which obviously you have to achieve through a traineeship. That's all that key stuff about the young person being prepared for the world of work. Some of you obviously will be inspected on a more regular basis because of you're good. But what is critical here is that for all of us, there is now a separate grade for traineeships if that's a substantive part of your work. So in other words, you're not receiving grades for individual subjects or subject areas. You're receiving, for example, a grade for study program, a grade for apprenticeships, a grade for traineeships, a grade for high needs students. So I just focused on the ones there. In terms of what they're looking for, I think this is critical. We've talked about cost efficiency, we've talked about effectiveness in terms of evaluation of outcomes. I think it's critical that when Ofsted are looking at traineeships, be aware of what they're looking at. And you'll see that all of those characteristics that we've talked about so far are exactly what inspectors are looking for. So hopefully you'll find that this webinar useful. Useful for those of you that are thinking of doing and planning to do webinars, not webinars, but traineeships, to do them well, particularly if you're looking at how Ofsted is going to view them, and also if you want to make sure that you're efficient in the use of your resources, for example, using the right staff for the right element. We use coaches, mentors, and assessors for all the stuff that doesn't involve direct delivery of things like English and maths or the flexible element, but also that you're aware of what measures are critical in terms of outcomes and the way that impacts on funding and quality indicators, as well as what Ofsted are looking for. And those of you who are already doing traineeships, like ourselves at Learning Curve and our partners, we hope that reflecting on this experience is going to make the offer even better in future. But there are still some significant obstacles to overcome. So thanks very much for the questions and the comments. Are there any other? And I think we've answered all the questions, but thanks very much for linking them, certainly for putting them to us. Thanks, Sarah, for your contributions. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Suzanne. Marcus, again, thanks for the comments you've made and the questions you've posed. And hopefully you'll find this useful. Share it with your colleagues, particularly those that couldn't attend today. And if there are any further questions, just put them through to Marek at e-Memoir, and he'll pass them on to me. Thanks very much, Marek. We can turn off the recording now.
Super. I'm just going to stop the recording. I mean, there was just a little point there from Sarah as well that might have just picked up there. But just before I get off and stop the recording, just to let you know again that the question has arisen. You will all be receiving a copy of the video recording along with the slides, and they'll be prepared and with you later on this afternoon. So sorry, yeah, keep the questions coming.